A forbidden flame, when love crosses the lines of loyalty. Life often takes us on unexpected journeys, testing the boundaries of love, loyalty, and self-discovery. For Ashley, what began as a simple weekend getaway to Michael's countryside home quickly unraveled into a story of longing, heartbreak, and impossible choices. In the quiet charm of a stone-clad cottage, nestled amidst rolling hills and blooming gardens, Ashley met Edward, a man whose presence ignited a spark she never anticipated. This is not just a tale of love but of its consequences, of moments that defy reason and emotions that challenge the very core of what is right and wrong. As lines blur and relationships falter, Ashley must navigate a path where every step threatens to alter the course of her life forever. Michael and I arrived at his father Edward's countryside cottage just as the sun was breaking through a delicate veil of morning mist. The scene was stunning, rolling green fields stretched into the horizon. Ancient trees stood like sentinels, and birds sang melodies that filled the tranquil air. Edward's house perched on a gentle hillside, its weathered stone facade surrounded by a meticulously maintained garden bursting with color and life. From the moment we stepped out of the car, I felt an unshakable sense of curiosity. Edward emerged to greet us, and what I saw took me by surprise. I had always imagined an elderly, frail man with a subdued demeanor. But Edward was nothing like I expected. He moved with confidence, dressed casually in a well-fitted sweater and jeans that highlighted his toned physique. His warm smile, framed by a hint of silver in his hair, exuded a youthful charm. His bright, sparkling eyes seemed to radiate vitality, and I found myself momentarily at a loss for words. "Hi, Dad." Michael greeted him warmly, pulling him into a hug. "Hello, son," Edward replied, his voice rich with genuine happiness. "I'm so glad you're here. How was the drive?" "Good overall, though we hit some traffic on the way," Michael said, glancing at me with a reassuring smile. As they chatted, I observed Edward more closely. He had an aura of ease and charisma that instantly drew me in. It was as if meeting him again opened a door to an entirely new perspective, one that made me feel like an uncharted chapter of life was about to unfold. "Ashley, why don't I show you around?" Michael offered, breaking my thoughts. "Sure," I replied, though my attention lingered on Edward. Michael led me through the house while he and Edward exchanged updates about work, investments, and other topics I didn't fully follow. The house itself was as charming as its surroundings, a blend of rustic and modern touches that reflected Edward's keen sense of style. However, it was clear that Edward himself was the heart of this home. Later, Edward offered to show me the garden. "If you're interested, I'd love to give you a tour. The garden's beautiful this time of year." "That sounds wonderful," I said eagerly. The thought of exploring the picturesque grounds felt like a perfect escape. As we stepped outside, I couldn't hide my delight at the sight before me. Every corner of the garden was a masterpiece: vivid flower beds, winding stone paths, and ancient trees that seemed to whisper stories of the past. Edward noticed my reaction and smiled, his pride evident. "This garden was wild when Lisa and I first moved here," he began, his tone tinged with nostalgia. "It took years of effort to turn it into what you see now. It's incredible," I said, genuinely impressed. "The organization and the harmony, it feels like everything has a purpose." Edward nodded, his eyes glinting with warmth. "Thank you. It was our shared project." Our little adventure. Lisa had a way of seeing beauty in the most unlikely places. As we wandered through the garden, Edward shared stories of the countless hours he and his late wife had spent cultivating it. His words painted vivid images of love, patience, and resilience. I listened intently, drawn in by his sincerity and openness. "You know," he said softly, pausing by a blooming rose bush. "After Lisa passed, this garden became my sanctuary. Working here keeps her memory alive." I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. But Edward's vulnerability touched me deeply. "It's a beautiful way to honor her," I said finally. "She must have been an amazing woman." "She was," Edward said, his voice steady despite the sadness in his eyes. "And every bloom here is a reminder of the life we built together." As the day unfolded, our conversations became more personal. Edward shared anecdotes about his youth, his travels, and his philosophies on life. There was a quiet wisdom in his words, a depth that drew me closer to him in a way I hadn't anticipated. That evening, as we prepared dinner together in the kitchen, I felt an unexpected sense of ease in Edward's presence. He moved effortlessly, chatting about everything from gardening techniques to favorite recipes. "I'm glad you came this weekend," he said, glancing at me with a smile. "It's rare to have moments like these, where we can slow down and truly connect." "I'm glad too," I replied, meeting his gaze. "There's something special about this place, and about you. It's clear how much love and effort you've poured into everything here." His expression softened. "Thank you, Ashley. Family and connection mean everything to me. Having you here makes this place feel alive again." Dinner was a cozy affair. The three of us sat around the table, sharing stories and laughter. Edward's attentiveness and kindness stood out, and I found myself increasingly drawn to his warmth and authenticity. By the time the evening ended, I realized that this weekend wasn't just about visiting Michael's father. It was about discovering a side of life, and a person, that I never expected to encounter. Edward wasn't just Michael's father. He was someone who embodied resilience, grace, and a quiet strength that left an indelible mark on me. I knew that this weekend would linger in my memory, not as a fleeting moment, but as a transformative experience filled with unexpected beauty and depth. That night, sitting by the fireplace and listening to Edward's stories, I felt an inexplicable connection growing between us. The soft glow of the fire illuminated his face, highlighting the lines etched by years of experience and the emotions he had shared. It was as though the warmth of the fire mirrored the warmth emanating from his words, drawing me closer to something I had not yet fully understood. For the first time in a long while, I felt as though I was uncovering a hidden truth about life, a truth that had always eluded me. As I climbed into bed later that night, my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The notion that life still held countless moments of surprise and unpredictability filled me with a strange mix of excitement and trepidation. I could not quite pinpoint what it was about Edward that intrigued me so deeply. But I was certain of one thing: this weekend was destined to be unlike anything I had anticipated. The evening had arrived more quickly than I expected. After assisting Edward in the kitchen, where we prepared a simple yet satisfying dinner, I noticed how Michael, my companion for the trip, had once again buried himself in his work. His focus was unwavering, but it brought an undeniable tension to the atmosphere. A tension that seemed to weigh on both Edward and me. Sensing this, Edward proposed that we spend the evening by the fireplace. His suggestion felt like an invitation to escape, and I accepted it with gratitude. eager to immerse myself in the tranquility he so effortlessly created. Edward's fireplace was more than a source of warmth, it was the heart of his home. Its golden light spilled across the room, softening the edges of the furniture and casting a comforting glow on the walls adorned with art and photographs. I nestled into a plush armchair, its embrace instantly soothing, while Edward chose the sofa opposite me. With practiced ease, he poured deep red wine into 2 glasses and handed one to me, a small smile playing on his lips. "You know, Ashley, I don't often get the chance to enjoy such peaceful evenings," Edward began, raising his glass slightly in a quiet toast. I returned the gesture, feeling the warmth of the fire seep into my skin. "I'm glad to be here," I replied sincerely. "There's something so special about this place." Edward nodded, his gaze sweeping across the room with quiet fondness. "This house holds many memories," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "My Lisa used to say that if these walls could talk, they'd have stories worth listening to." At the mention of Lisa, Edward's late wife, his expression softened, and his eyes took on a faraway look. I felt an urge to know more about her, to understand the part of Edward's life that seemed to have shaped so much of who he was. "How did you and Lisa meet?" I asked, genuinely curious. Edward took a contemplative sip of his wine before answering. "It was many years ago," he began, his voice steady yet wistful. "We met at a university party. I was young, ambitious, and perhaps a bit reckless back then. She was radiant, with this undeniable spark in her eyes. From the moment I saw her, I felt as though I'd stumbled upon something extraordinary." "That sounds like the beginning of a beautiful story," I said, captivated by the imagery his words conjured. "What happened next?" "We became inseparable," Edward continued, a faint smile curving his lips. "We traveled together, explored new places, and shared dreams of what our future might hold. Lisa had this incredible ability to find beauty in the simplest things. She was my compass, always pointing me toward what truly mattered." There was a pause, and I noticed a subtle shift in his tone as he added, "Losing her was the hardest thing I've ever faced." "I can't imagine how difficult that must have been," I said softly, my heart aching for the pain he must have endured. Edward's gaze fell to the floor, but his voice remained steady. "Some days are harder than others. I still wake up expecting to hear her say good morning. But over time, I've learned to find solace in the memories we created together. They remind me to be grateful for the time we had, even if it wasn't as long as I'd hoped." His words resonated deeply, stirring emotions I hadn't expected. As the conversation flowed, Edward opened up about Lisa's love for painting and how she had poured her soul into her art. He gestured toward a painting on the wall, its vibrant colors and intricate details a testament to her talent. "She had this incredible way of seeing the extraordinary in the ordinary," Edward said, his voice filled with admiration. "Even a simple vase of flowers could become a masterpiece under her brush." "She sounds remarkable," I said, my gaze lingering on the painting. "You must have learned so much from her." "I did," Edward admitted, his expression thoughtful. "Lisa taught me to appreciate life in ways I never had before. Those lessons are part of who I am now." A comfortable silence settled between us, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire. Then, with a hint of vulnerability, Edward said, "Sometimes I wonder if I could have done more, been more attentive, more present." But I've come to realize that we all make mistakes. And the best we can do is learn to forgive ourselves. I could feel the sincerity in his words. And it struck a chord within me. I think you gave her everything you could, I said gently. And that's what truly matters. Edward's smile was small but genuine. Thank you, Ashley. That means a lot. As the evening stretched on, I found myself drawn to Edward in ways I couldn't quite explain. His openness, his depth of emotion, and the warmth in his demeanor created an intimacy that was both comforting and disarming. I tried to keep my feelings at bay, knowing they could complicate everything I thought I knew about myself. Yet, I couldn't deny that something was shifting. Something that might change the course of my life. The hours slipped by unnoticed as we continued talking. Our conversation weaving a tapestry of shared stories, reflections, and newfound understanding. Sitting by the fire, enveloped in its glow, I felt the weight of the moment settle over me. This evening, I realized, was more than a fleeting experience. It was the beginning of something profound. Something I might not fully grasp for some time. And yet, deep down, I knew it would leave an indelible mark on both our lives. The evening after our first conversation by the fireplace unfolded in a way that was just as profound. Perhaps even more so. Despite my efforts to remain composed, an inexplicable anticipation hummed within me. Michael and Edward had spent the entire day immersed in various tasks around the house, while I wandered its many corridors and rooms, uncovering hidden corners and small details that added to its charm. The house exuded an old-world coziness that made me feel both nostalgic and at peace, as if it were slowly wrapping me in its history. As the sun dipped below the horizon and its warm golden light faded, the three of us naturally gravitated back to the fireplace, which had already become a sacred space for our evening gatherings. The fire crackled softly, its orange glow casting flickering shadows across the room. Edward, in particularly high spirits, suggested opening the bottle of wine we had left untouched the previous night. I gladly accepted, finding comfort in the familiar ritual as I settled into the same sofa I had claimed before. The air was rich with the aroma of aged wood and the faint, lingering traces of a day well spent. The atmosphere that evening was intimate, almost dreamlike, as the soft lighting and rhythmic crackling of the fire drew us into another world. We began to talk, our voices hushed as though out of reverence for the moment. This time, however, our conversation ventured into deeply personal territory, peeling back the layers of formality that had previously defined our interactions. You know, Ashley, Edward began, his tone thoughtful yet hesitant. There's something about you that reminds me of Lisa. His words hung in the air, and I felt a small pang of curiosity mixed with unease. Edward's gaze was unwavering, his eyes reflecting a mixture of vulnerability and something deeper. Something I couldn't quite name. I tilted my head slightly, trying to absorb the weight of his statement. In what way do I remind you of her? I asked cautiously, though my mind had already begun to race. The way he spoke of Lisa, the lingering emotion in his voice, hinted at a story that felt both distant and deeply personal. Edward leaned forward, clasping his hands together as though searching for the right words. It's in your kindness, he said finally, his voice tinged with both nostalgia and admiration. Your sincerity, the way you carry yourself. Lisa was someone who always saw the good in people, even when they didn't see it in themselves. And you have that same warmth. His words stirred something within me. A quiet but profound emotion that I wasn't prepared for. It was as if his observations had reached a part of me that I rarely allowed others to see. I smiled softly, trying to mask the unexpected vulnerability his words had unearthed. "That's very kind of you to say," I replied, my voice steady despite the swirl of emotions beneath the surface. I've always believed in the importance of treating people with compassion. A silence fell between us. But it was not uncomfortable. Instead, it was thick with unspoken words, with feelings that neither of us dared to fully articulate. Edward's gaze lingered, his eyes studying me with an intensity that made my heart quicken. I noticed the way his gaze briefly fell to my lips before quickly returning to my eyes. "You know," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "Sometimes we find pieces of the past in others. And when we do, it's a reminder of what truly matters in life." His words carried a weight that made my breath hitch. In that moment, the room seemed to shrink until it was just the two of us, caught in a fragile, unspoken understanding. Almost without thinking, I reached out, my fingers brushing against his face in a gesture that felt instinctive yet monumental. It was an attempt to convey something words could not: gratitude, connection, and perhaps even longing. "Thank you for sharing that with me," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper, acting on an impulse I couldn't suppress. I leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. It was meant as a simple gesture of appreciation. But the moment my lips touched his skin, something electric passed between us. The air seemed to shift, becoming charged with an intensity that neither of us could ignore. Edward froze, his expression a mixture of surprise and something deeper, something that mirrored the storm of emotions swirling within me. His skin was warm against my lips. And for a fleeting moment, the world felt impossibly still. When he turned to face me, our eyes met. And in his gaze, I saw a reflection of my own tumultuous feelings. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he leaned in, and our lips met in a kiss that was both tender and uncertain. It was a kiss that spoke of unspoken desires and unacknowledged truths. A moment suspended between the past and the present. When we finally pulled away, Edward's voice was barely audible. "Ashley," he whispered, his tone laced with both apology and longing. "I didn't mean for this to happen so quickly." A blush rose to my cheeks, and I averted my gaze, feeling both exhilarated and embarrassed. "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I didn't mean to." "No," Edward interrupted gently, taking my hand in his. "You don't need to apologize. I felt it too." His words sent a shiver through me, and I realized that the kiss had been more than a fleeting moment, it had been a turning point. Something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of quiet conversation and stolen glances. Though we spoke of ordinary things, the connection forged by that kiss lingered in the air, unspoken but undeniable. When the time came to part for the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that my world had irrevocably changed. As I lay in bed later, the memory of the kiss replayed in my mind, filling me with a strange mixture of anticipation and trepidation. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing with certainty: the bond between Edward and me had deepened in a way that neither of us could ignore. The morning light seeped through the curtains, but its warmth couldn't chase away the storm brewing inside me. I lay in bed, replaying the events of the previous night. My heart felt heavy, my mind clouded with guilt. The kitchen, once my sanctuary, now felt cold and foreign. Michael trusted me, Yet I had allowed myself to step into a forbidden space with Edward. Michael, immersed in his work, hadn't noticed my turmoil. I threw myself into chores, trying to silence the endless questions swirling in my mind. But the harder I tried to avoid Edward, the closer he seemed to get. After lunch, I sought refuge in the garden, a book in hand, hoping its pages could shield me from my thoughts. Then, his voice pierced the fragile peace. "Ashley," Edward called softly, his presence at the garden gate both a relief and a dread. "Can we talk?" My heart pounded, but I nodded, knowing avoidance wasn't a solution. We sat on the bench beneath the blooming jasmine. His face, earnest yet vulnerable, made it impossible to look away. "Ashley, I'm sorry for what happened," he began, his voice low. "I never meant for things to spiral out of control." His words struck a chord, and I felt both relief and shame. "I can't stop thinking about Michael," I confessed. "This shouldn't have happened." "I know," he replied, his sincerity unshaken. "But I need to be honest with you. I've tried to suppress it, but I can't. I have feelings for you, feelings I've tried to ignore for too long. What happened wasn't meaningless to me." The weight of his confession silenced me. My heart warred with my mind, torn between loyalty and a truth I was reluctant to face. "Edward," I said softly, "I don't know what to say. I never wanted this. And now, I don't know how to fix it." "You don't need to have the answers right now," he said gently. "I just want you to know that this isn't your fault. We were both caught in a moment. But I'm here. And we'll figure it out together." His words, though kind, only deepened the ache in my chest. "What about Michael?" I asked. "He doesn't deserve this." "No, he doesn't," Edward admitted. "But we need to understand our feelings before we can decide what's right. I don't want you to carry this alone." The tenderness in his voice disarmed me. As he touched my shoulder, a quiet warmth spread through me, comforting yet complicated. I took a deep breath, my voice trembling. "We need time. Time to make sense of this and figure out where we go from here." Edward nodded, his gaze steady. "Whatever happens, I'll be here. You don't have to do this alone." We sat in silence, the garden alive with the hum of nature. But the world around us felt muted. In that moment, unspoken emotions lingered between us, a connection undeniable yet impossible. The path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. But one thing was clear: this was the beginning of a reckoning neither of us could escape. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the estate, casting soft golden light across the floor. But the house remained shrouded in an almost tangible tension. The candid conversation Edward and I had shared in the garden the day before lingered in the air, shaping our thoughts and emotions. It was as though the unspoken truths we had finally admitted had transformed the atmosphere around us. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, we decided that staying cooped up indoors would only heighten the strain. A change of scenery was needed, a way to step back from the weight of our revelations. The idea of a walk through the nearby woods appealed to us both. It offered a chance to lose ourselves in nature's tranquility, to find solace in the rhythmic cadence of our footsteps. Though it was an unusual choice given the complexity of our situation, it felt like the right way to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. Dressed in comfortable clothes and sturdy shoes, we left the house, crossing the manicured garden and heading toward the forests that bordered the estate. The morning air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the faint aroma of pine. It was a welcome contrast to the heavy, stifling atmosphere we had left behind. "I've always loved this part of the forest," Edward said as the trail opened into a sunlit glade. His voice carried a warmth I hadn't heard in days. And he gazed at the green expanse with a nostalgic fondness. "There's something timeless about it. It's as though the trees themselves hold secrets from centuries past. And walking among them always makes me feel at peace." I smiled at his words, sharing his appreciation for the beauty surrounding us. "It's true," I replied, my voice soft. "Being here feels like stepping into another world. The quiet, the simplicity of it all, it's like the forest knows how to silence the noise in our hearts." We walked in companionable silence for a while. The sound of our footsteps mingling with the cheerful chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves stirred by the gentle breeze. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting golden patterns on the path ahead. It felt as though the forest itself was welcoming us, wrapping us in its serene embrace. From time to time, we paused to admire a particularly vibrant patch of moss or the intricate details of animal tracks etched into the soft earth. Each stop was an opportunity to marvel at the small wonders of the natural world and, perhaps unintentionally, to avoid the larger questions that hung between us. As we ventured deeper into the woods, I noticed a change in Edward. The guarded expression he often wore had softened, replaced by an openness I hadn't seen before. His words came more freely, his tone lighter and more animated. "You know, Ashley," he began after a quiet moment, his voice carrying a contemplative note, "there's something about the forest that feels honest. Out here, it's easier to see things for what they really are. I don't feel the need to pretend or hide." I turned to look at him, struck by the sincerity in his gaze. "I think I understand," I said. "There's a freedom here that makes it easier to let go of pretense. Maybe that's why it feels so comforting. It's a space where we can just be ourselves." We continued walking, but our steps slowed as the conversation deepened. Edward's gaze met mine frequently, and each time, I felt an unspoken understanding pass between us. The light-hearted remarks of earlier gave way to more personal reflections. And with each shared word, the bond between us grew stronger. "Ashley," Edward said suddenly, stopping in his tracks. His voice was steady, but I could hear the undercurrent of emotion. "I can't keep pretending nothing has changed. What happened between us, it's not something I can ignore anymore." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My heart raced, each beat echoing the truth I had been trying to suppress. "I know," I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I feel it too. But Edward, I'm afraid. Whatever this is, it's not simple. It could complicate everything." Edward stepped closer, his expression filled with a mixture of determination and tenderness. He reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from my face. And for a moment, the world around us seemed to fade away. "Ashley," he murmured, "some things are worth the risk. And I know this is one of them." Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both hesitant and full of conviction. It was a kiss that spoke of unspoken feelings, of a connection that had been building for far longer than either of us had admitted. Time seemed to stand still as the forest around us became a silent witness to this intimate moment. When the kiss ended, we stood there, hands intertwined, a new understanding passing between us. The walk back to the estate was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. The tension that had weighed on us earlier was gone, replaced by a sense of anticipation for what lay ahead. That evening, as we sat by the fireplace, the flickering flames casting warm light across the room, we spoke openly about our fears and hopes. Edward suggested a brief escape, a night at a small inn in the nearby town where we could truly be alone, away from prying eyes and the expectations of the estate. The drive to the inn was peaceful, the car gliding along quiet roads illuminated by soft moonlight. The air was cold but refreshing, and as we neared our destination, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. The town was quaint, its cobblestone streets and warm lights inviting. In the privacy of our room, with no barriers between us, we found a sense of clarity. Our connection was undeniable, and though the path forward was uncertain, we were ready to face it together. The hotel we chose was secluded and cozy, nestled amidst a serene landscape that felt worlds away from the chaos of everyday life. As soon as we entered the room, a sense of warmth and tranquility washed over me like a gentle wave. The space was impeccably designed, radiating comfort with its plush chairs, ambient lighting, and an inviting atmosphere that seemed to embrace us in its calm. "Well, here we are," Edward said with a soft smile as he placed the luggage by the door. "I hope you like this place." I glanced around, taking in every detail, the delicate arrangement of flowers on the nightstand, the flickering light of the faux fireplace, and the faint aroma of lavender lingering in the air. It was perfect. "This is exactly what we need," I replied, my voice carrying a note of contentment. "Everything looks just perfect." Edward's eyes brightened at my approval. He suggested we settle on the couch, and as I sank into its softness, he walked over to the small table where an array of light snacks and refreshments had been meticulously arranged. Moments later, he returned with a steaming cup of tea and handed it to me with a gesture so thoughtful that it warmed me more than the tea itself. He sat beside me, close enough for our shoulders to touch, and our eyes met. His gaze held something beyond kindness. It was filled with a tenderness that made my heart flutter. "Ashley," he began, his tone gentle but firm, "I want to spend this evening with you, just the two of us. We don't have to do anything special. Just talk and enjoy each other's company." His words resonated deeply. "I want that too," I admitted, feeling a wave of calm settle over me. We moved closer, and as our conversation unfolded, the walls around my heart began to lower. Edward shared pieces of his life with me, each word carrying weight and vulnerability. He spoke of the pain of losing his wife and the years he had spent finding his way back to a semblance of normalcy. His voice trembled slightly as he recounted the memories, and I felt each story etch itself onto my heart. "You know, Ashley," he said after a pause, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me hold my breath. "These past years have been challenging, but I've found moments of joy amidst the struggles. Your presence these days has been a greater comfort than I can express." His sincerity left me speechless. The honesty in his voice mirrored the connection I felt growing between us. I reached out, placing my hand on his. "Edward," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I feel there's something special between us. Despite everything, I truly enjoy being with you." He moved closer, his hand reaching up to gently brush a strand of hair from my face. His touch was soft, warm, and filled with emotion. Our eyes locked, and in that moment, words became unnecessary. The space between us disappeared as he leaned in, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was both tender and electrifying. It was a moment suspended in time, where the world outside faded into insignificance, leaving only the raw, unspoken connection between us. As the evening unfolded, the barriers between us crumbled entirely. We spoke of dreams, fears, and hopes, each revelation weaving an invisible thread that bound us closer. Edward held me tightly, and I felt the depth of his emotions in every embrace. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to fully be in the moment, free of hesitation or doubt. Morning arrived with a quiet serenity, but the air carried a subtle tension. The memories of the previous night lingered, their warmth tempered by the cold reality of what lay ahead. Edward and I had shared something profound, but the weight of unspoken truths and moral dilemmas pressed heavily on my mind. My thoughts drifted to Michael, the man I had vowed to love and stand by, and guilt began to creep in, tainting the happiness I had felt. We spent the morning in silence, going through the motions of daily life while an invisible storm brewed within me. Edward suggested we return to his country house to avoid arousing suspicion, and I agreed reluctantly. The journey back was filled with unspoken words and stolen glances, each of us lost in our own thoughts. When we arrived, Michael was already home. His presence filled the space with an unspoken tension that was impossible to ignore. He looked tired, his demeanor irritable, which was understandable after a long day at work. His gaze lingered on Edward for a moment too long, but he said nothing, and the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. I busied myself with trivial tasks, avoiding eye contact and keeping interactions to a minimum in an attempt to maintain the fragile balance of our lives. Yet, beneath the surface, I could feel the cracks beginning to form. The choices I had made, the emotions I had allowed myself to feel, and the truths I had chosen to ignore were all converging into a storm I could no longer avoid. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I knew that the path ahead would be anything but simple. Late in the evening, after Michael had gone to his room, I finally decided to check the messages on my phone. A sense of unease settled over me as I noticed several unread notifications that I hadn't had the chance to go through. With a deep breath, I opened them. Among the messages was one from Edward. As I read it, my heart sank. It was filled with words of love and tenderness, expressions I had not anticipated. The unexpected sentiment left me reeling, my emotions a whirlwind of guilt and confusion. Just as I tried to process Edward's words, I heard footsteps behind me. My stomach dropped, and I turned around to see Michael standing in the doorway. His face was pale, worry and tension etched into his features. He held his phone tightly in one hand, his knuckles white from the grip. His eyes bore into mine, filled with suspicion and hurt. "Ashley," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "we need to talk. I've discovered something I can't ignore." My chest tightened, and my heart began to pound wildly. I knew what was coming, but the thought of facing it was unbearable. Michael's words confirmed my worst fears. He had found out. Slowly, he walked closer, his face flushed with a mix of anger and betrayal. "What do you mean?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady, though panic clawed at my insides. Without a word, Michael held out his phone. The screen displayed an open message from Edward, the same message that had left me shaken moments ago. In it, Edward spoke of his feelings and mentioned our last night together. My legs wobbled, and I had to steady myself against the couch. Words failed me as I tried to formulate an explanation. Michael. I can explain. I stammered. But my voice quivered with fear and regret. I couldn't find the words to bridge the chasm that had suddenly opened between us. How could you? Michael interrupted. His voice thick with pain and disbelief. How could you do this to me? To my father? To our family? The weight of his accusations hit me like a tidal wave. Tears welled up in my eyes. And I felt my heart splinter into 1,000 pieces. Everything I had tried to hide had been laid bare. I knew I had crossed a line I could never uncross. And now, the consequences were staring me in the face. Michael. I began. My voice breaking. I was foolish and wrong. I never intended to hurt you. But it wasn't something I could control. Michael's eyes narrowed. His brows knitting together in a storm of emotions. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. His face a mixture of anger and profound disappointment. I can't believe this is happening, he said finally. His voice barely above a whisper. I need to understand. Ashley. Why? Why would you do this? What led you to betray me like this? His question cut through me like a blade. The truth was tangled and complicated. And I knew no explanation would suffice. Still, I had to try. I can't justify my actions, I said, swallowing the lump in my throat. I was lost. Michael. Confused. I sought comfort where I shouldn't have. It was a mistake, one I deeply regret. Michael stared at me for what felt like an eternity. His face a canvas of exhaustion and heartbreak. His silence spoke louder than words. And I could see him grappling with the weight of what he'd just learned. I don't know what to do next, he said finally. His voice hoarse. I need time. Ashley. Time to figure out how I feel. I can't just forget this. I nodded. My heart heavy with the understanding that our relationship would never be the same. An ache settled deep within me as I watched him turn and walk away, leaving me alone in the room. The silence that followed was deafening. I sank onto the couch, the tears I'd been holding back spilling over. My mind raced with regret and self-recrimination. I had shattered the trust we once shared. And now the pieces lay scattered, impossible to gather. For hours, I sat there, replaying the events in my mind. I knew I couldn't undo the past. But I also knew I needed to confront the aftermath. Michael deserved time and space. And I had to respect that. The road ahead was uncertain. And the damage I had caused would take more than words to repair. As dawn began to break, casting a pale light through the window, I resolved to face whatever lay ahead with honesty and accountability. My actions had forever altered the fabric of our lives. But if there was any hope of healing, it would begin with accepting the consequences and working tirelessly to rebuild what had been broken. That day, when Michael told me about his decision, I felt the air in the room grow even thicker and heavier, as if the weight of his words had filled every corner. He sat across from me in the living room, his posture resolute, his demeanor calm. Yet I could sense the turmoil within him. Each word he spoke seemed to echo in my mind, carving an indelible mark deep into my heart. Ashley, he began, his voice steady but laced with an underlying strain. I've been thinking about us, about our future. And I've come to the conclusion that I can't continue our relationship. I've filed for divorce. His words landed like blows, each one harder than the last. My breath caught in my throat, and my vision blurred as tears welled up. I wanted to speak, to argue, to plead, but the words clung to the back of my throat, refusing to emerge. All I could do was sit there, paralyzed, as the life we had built together began to disintegrate before my eyes. "Michael," I finally managed to whisper, my voice trembling. "I understand what I've done. And I'm not trying to justify my actions. I know I can't change what happened. But please believe me when I say that I truly regret the pain I've caused you." My words hung in the air, heavy and fraught with sincerity. But his expression remained unchanged. He sat silently, his gaze piercing yet distant. The hum of the air conditioner filled the room, a backdrop to the suffocating silence that followed. Michael's eyes met mine, his expression a mixture of anger and sorrow. He seemed to be wrestling with his thoughts, weighing his next words carefully. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you," he admitted. "But I need to move on. I need to cleanse my life of everything that reminds me of what happened." His words were final, and I nodded, accepting the inevitability of his decision. The weight of the moment pressed down on me, suffocating, yet undeniable. "When do you plan to start the divorce process?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. My voice felt hollow, as if it belonged to someone else. "I've already started," Michael replied, his tone practical, devoid of emotion. "Meetings with lawyers will be scheduled in the coming days. I want everything to go as quickly and smoothly as possible." His words were a dagger, twisting the reality of our situation deeper into my heart. I nodded again, unable to find the strength to say more. "I'll need some time to pack my things," I said, my voice steady but void of life. "I'll leave as soon as possible." He nodded in agreement, and I felt the growing formality of our interaction, a stark contrast to the intimacy we once shared. The days that followed were a blur of packing and reflection. Each item I placed in a box seemed to carry a memory, a fragment of our shared history. Sorting through our possessions was both an exhausting and cathartic process. I lingered over photos, mementos, and trinkets that once symbolized joy and togetherness, now reduced to remnants of a life that no longer existed. At times, the weight of my emotions became too much to bear, and I found solace in the solitude of quiet tears. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, I took a final walk through the house. I wandered through each room, my footsteps slow and deliberate. I stepped into the backyard, where Michael and I had spent countless evenings tending to our garden. The flowers we had planted together now seemed foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. I tried to memorize every detail, knowing this was the last time I would call this place home. When the final box was loaded into my car, I stood in the driveway and took one last look at the house. A wave of bittersweet emotion washed over me. This was where we had laughed, loved, and dreamed of a future together. Now, it was simply a chapter closing, a part of my life that I was leaving behind. I climbed into the car and drove away, the road stretching endlessly before me. The city lights ahead signaled a new beginning, though uncertainty loomed over what lay ahead. Arriving at my new apartment, I was struck by its emptiness. The bare walls and quiet rooms mirrored the void within me. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window as rain streaked down the glass. The storm outside seemed to echo the tempest within my soul. I knew this was just the beginning of a long, arduous journey, one filled with challenges I had yet to face. As I settled into this new chapter, I couldn't help but reflect on the past and what the future might hold. Despite the pain, I clung to a glimmer of hope, a belief that I could rebuild, find solace, and perhaps one day rediscover the happiness that now felt so distant. The road ahead would be difficult, but I was determined to walk it, one step at a time. Weeks had slipped by like grains of sand through my fingers, and I finally decided it was time to meet with Edward. I clung to the fragile hope that our connection, something that once felt so unbreakable, could be the foundation for something new, something stable. We agreed to meet at a cozy, unassuming cafe nestled in the heart of the city, a place where I had imagined rekindling the spark that once lit up our lives. When I stepped inside, the warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee greeted me, but it did little to calm the storm raging within. My eyes scanned the room until they found Edward, sitting by the window with the golden glow of the late afternoon sun framing his silhouette. He looked as handsome as ever, but his expression carried an unfamiliar weight, a somber intensity that set my heart racing. My steps faltered for a moment as I tried to collect myself, steadying my trembling hands before making my way to him. "Hello, Edward," I said softly, taking the seat across from him. My voice wavered, but I managed a faint smile. "Thank you for coming." He looked up, his deep brown eyes meeting mine. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw a glimmer of the man I used to know, but the warmth quickly faded, replaced by a guarded coolness. "Hello, Ashley," he replied, his voice even and measured, yet devoid of the affection I had once taken for granted. "I hope you weren't expecting too much from this meeting." His words were like a dagger to my chest. I had braced myself for a difficult conversation, but nothing could have prepared me for the bluntness of his tone. My heart clenched, and I struggled to suppress the rising tide of emotions. "I was hoping we could talk about the future," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to understand where we stand. What we're going to do next." Edward exhaled deeply, his gaze drifting to the bustling street outside. The pause stretched unbearably, each passing second amplifying my anxiety. "Ashley," he said at last, his voice heavy with deliberation, "I've spent a lot of time thinking about us, about what happened, and I've come to the conclusion that I need to prioritize my family, my son, Michael, my values, and my responsibilities to them. They have to come first. I can't let anything jeopardize that." His words struck like a thunderclap, each one reverberating through me with crushing finality. I felt my breath hitch, my world tilting precariously. I had come here seeking solace, a path forward, but instead, I was met with an impenetrable wall. "But what about us?" I asked, my voice trembling under the weight of my despair. "We had something special, Edward. I thought we could build a future on that." He turned his gaze back to me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. "I know what we had was real," he said quietly, his voice tinged with sorrow, "but I can't ignore the consequences of my actions. Maintaining peace in my family is more important than anything else, even if it means ending things with you." Tears welled up, blurring my vision as I fought to maintain my composure. The room seemed to close in around me, suffocating in its quiet intimacy. I knew I couldn't change his mind, But the reality of losing him, of losing us, was unbearable. "I don't know what to say," I whispered, my voice breaking. I wanted things to be different. "Edward." I wanted us to find a way. The silence that followed was deafening. Each unspoken word hanging between us like a weight neither of us could lift. Finally, Edward pushed back his chair, signaling the end of our meeting. We stood together, the distance between us more palpable than ever before. As we embraced one final time, I felt the tremor in his body, a silent acknowledgement of the pain we both carried. "Thank you for meeting me," I murmured, my voice thick with emotion. He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears, before turning and walking away. The sight of his retreating figure was a stab to my heart, a poignant reminder of the life we would never have. Stepping out into the cold air, I felt the rain begin to fall, a steady rhythm that mirrored the tears I had fought so hard to contain. I walked aimlessly through the streets, each step heavier than the last. The city, once vibrant and alive, now seemed shrouded in a gray, oppressive gloom. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of Edward's absence pressed down on me like a relentless tide. My once vibrant apartment, filled with shared memories and laughter, now felt hollow and lifeless. I tried to distract myself with work, with hobbies, with anything that might dull the ache. But nothing could fill the void. One evening, as I sorted through a box of old letters and photos, a flood of memories washed over me. There we were, smiling, carefree, and full of hope. The stark contrast to my current reality was like a punch to the gut. I cried until there were no tears left, the catharsis both painful and necessary. Gradually, I began to rebuild. Each day was a battle, but I found solace in small victories, a kind word from a stranger, a moment of quiet reflection in the park, the warmth of the sun breaking through the clouds. I started to understand that healing wouldn't come all at once, but in fragments, pieced together over time. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure: I had to find strength within myself. The love I had lost with Edward was a chapter in my life, not the end of the story. And so, with each tentative step forward, I resolved to create a new narrative, one that embraced both the pain of the past and the promise of the future. Months turned into years, and Ashley found herself standing on the precipice of a life rebuilt from pain and self-reflection. She had moved to a new city, embraced a quieter existence, and learned to live with the scars of her choices. The memories of Edward and Michael lingered, not as a source of regret but as lessons, reminders of the complexity of the human heart and the weight of trust. Edward chose to dedicate himself fully to his family, honoring the values he held dear, while Michael eventually found peace and began a new chapter of his own. Their lives diverged from Ashley's, but in a strange, bittersweet way. Each of them grew stronger from the fractures they once endured. For Ashley, the journey was about rediscovering herself. She sought therapy, reconnected with old friends, and found joy in the smallest moments: a sunrise, a favorite song, or the laughter of strangers at a cafe. Over time, she understood that mistakes, no matter how profound, did not define her. What mattered was the courage to face them, learn from them, and strive to be better. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss our next heartfelt and captivating tales. Together, we'll continue to explore the beauty and depth of human emotions.